Prison is all about routine. You wake up at about the same time every day. You eat pretty much the same food. You read the same books, go out and do the same stuff. You go to sleep at about the same time every night. That's 90% of the time you spent in prison. But it's the other 10% you remember. Those are the adrenaline-fueled, heart-pumping, sometimes wondering if you're going to survive your incarceration days. One of those 10% times that I'm always going to remember is whenever I was moved from the yard on E-Yard at SADF to D-Gym at SADF, the gymnasium on D-Yard. E-Yard had been very low security. I suppose there were probably a couple of knives somewhere on the yard, but I'd never seen them. I'd never heard of them being used. D-Yard was far more serious. I hadn't been in the gymnasium for a half hour whenever a guy sidled up and offered me a knife, suggested that it was just best to stay strapped if you were going to be there. It was also very crowded in D-Gym. You have to understand that California was undergoing an inmate housing crisis. They had far more inmates in the system than they had cells in which to house them. They can't just build a bunch of cells overnight, so what they had to do was start putting bunks into the common exercise area that they had designated, the gymnasium. And they kept putting bunks into the gymnasium. I'm going to show some clips of what these gymnasiums looked like before the court finally came in and said they couldn't keep putting people into these gymnasiums. At the time that I moved in, I believe there were 130 inmates housed in an area not too much bigger than a basketball court. It was a scary place. It was set aside for inmates that had fighting problems, that were in gangs. They made it a point to put the worst inmates that they had into this gymnasium. They also put the majority of the Jewish inmates that they had at this institution into this gymnasium. It wasn't due to anything they'd done, it's just where the administration elected to house them. It was a nasty place. It wasn't all bad, though. I made a good friend while I was housed at D-Gym. The first day that I was there, I met a guy named Tool, and he stood out because he wasn't like most other inmates that I met. Your vast majority of inmates on an SNY yard fall into one of three categories. You have your gang leaders. By gang leader, I don't necessarily mean somebody who leads a gang. I mean somebody who has leadership potential who is in a gang. They're charismatic or intelligent, they are capable of doing pretty much what they want with their lives, and what they've chosen to do is to participate in a gang, to amass a little bit of power, get some respect. Your second group are the gang members, the followers. They're far less able to determine where the gang is going to go. They're bullies and cowards. What they do is they band together for strength or for the ability to steal from and pick on those that are weaker than them. And your third group, sadly, are the victims. These are the people who are picked on by the gangs, who are elderly or infirm, or for some reason the gangs have decided are easy pickings. Perhaps they're not able to stand up for themselves. Tool didn't fall into any of these categories. He was young, intelligent, and charismatic. I suppose he could have been a gang leader if he wanted to. But he didn't feel that the ability to take something from somebody gave him the moral authority to take something from somebody. He was a decent person, and there are so few of those in prison that he and I became friends quickly. In fact, the first night that I was in D-Gym, he sat on my bunk and we talked for hours, probably till 2 or 3 in the morning. You have to understand that the bunks went a lower bunk here and then a higher bunk up here. And so he could sit there and talk with me. What hadn't occurred to me was that my bunk mate was being kept up all night long by our talking. Had he pointed out that he felt that I was being discourteous or that he couldn't sleep, Tool and I would have stopped immediately, but rather than doing that, my bunkmate T just seethed. All night long he seethed and got angrier and angrier until finally in the morning he woke up, and first thing in the morning he kicked my bunk and said, "Aaron, you got to get up right now. You got to tell those cops we can't live together. You got to go tell them you got to get out of here because I'm going to hurt you otherwise. We can't live together, man. I'm not going to put up with your shit." I had no idea what was going on, and it took a little while for me to understand that I had kept him up and that he was angry about it. I apologized. I said, I'm sorry, it won't happen again. I didn't know I was keeping you up. But he was hearing none of it. As far as he was concerned, things had progressed too far, and this was an altercation that was going to have to be settled with violence. At the point that it became clear that I wasn't going to back down, that I wasn't just going to go roll up because he told me to, he did something which I suppose was clever, but it was an awful thing to do. It was really crummy. He took a moment, waited until a lull in the conversation, he took a deep breath and announced, "Who are you calling I don't want to use the word that he used, but suffice to say, it was about the nastiest thing that you could say to an African American in an argument. And it was about the dumbest thing you could say if you were surrounded and outnumbered 20-1 by people of his ethnicity when you had no friends to support you." The gym went quiet. Everybody was looking at us, and I was trying to figure out some way to explain that I hadn't and wouldn't have used that word. He stormed off. As I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do if 15 or 20 guys come running at me and start beating me, Tool walks over, boots in hand, starts immediately putting them on and stands next to me. He made it clear that it wasn't going to be 15 or 20 on 1. It was going to be 15 or 20 on 2. This was an incredibly brave thing for him to have done. The idea of getting jumped and stomped on or stabbed by overwhelming numbers is terrifying. About 5 minutes later, the shot caller came over, Jamal. He was calm but confrontational, assertive. Looked me right in the eye and said, "So T tells me you got a problem with black folk." I told him, "No, I do not. What happened is that T and I had been having words, and he got very loud and racial whenever I hadn't done anything to provoke it. I was just trying to de-escalate the situation." Jamal was receptive. Apparently, T had on previous occasions done about the same thing. He had taken incidents that could have been just a little thing and tried to turn them into a giant racial thing. Because he didn't want to fight somebody one-on-one. He wanted it to be a giant race riot where he outnumbered his opponent. Jamal left, came back about 5 minutes later. He didn't have his boots on anymore. He was wearing shower shoes. He was calm. He smiled, made a little joke and chuckled, shook my hand. He wasn't doing this for my benefit. He was doing this so that anybody watching, and you better believe there were 130 people watching, would understand that if T came back over and started problems, he came at me, it wasn't going to be T and his 19 homies and Jamal. It was just going to be T and me. And there's a world of difference between those two situations. Sure enough, T did come back a couple of minutes later, and he shot me daggers with his eyes, looked at me, and did a little... climbed up on his bed and didn't say another word to me. He didn't like the idea of a one-on-one affair fight. Which, T was a big guy. In all honesty, I had no interest in having a physical altercation with anybody, really, but particularly not somebody of his size. But I guess he wasn't interested in that type of situation. Thankfully, about 2 days later, the cops realized that T and I having to live together was causing tension, and they moved me to another area of the gymnasium. They moved Tool also. He and I got to be bunkies, and it was a much better living arrangement than most anything that I could have imagined in that environment. Tool was a decent guy. He didn't have to do any of those things. He put his safety, his life, his health on the line to stand next to me because he knew it was the right thing, because he knew that I hadn't done what I was accused of doing. Out here in the real world, not in prison, the stakes are rarely that high. Generally, whenever you see the right thing to do, it's something small. It's letting somebody in front of you in traffic, or going and giving the homeless guy $5, helping your friend move his couch. There's very rarely life or death, getting beaten until you can't stand consequences attached to doing the right thing. Which is all the more reason that we should do the right thing. If you take that extra time and energy to help somebody that you know needs it, they'll be grateful. They'll remember it. It will change their lives. I might have died that day. I got told that T had been walking around with a nice sharp knife, just looking for a couple of guys to help him take me out. Tool being there, helping me, might have made the difference. I will always remember that. I will always be grateful for that. And the guy that you help, the 5 minutes that you spend, I'm sure they'll be grateful for that too.